phone rang at 6:14 in the morning, and some animal part of Ruth Calloway knew before she answered that her life was about to split into a before and an after again. "Is this Ruth Calloway, formerly of Larkspur Lane?" She sat up in the dark, throat dry, and said yes before she understood what she was agreeing to. The voice on the other end belonged to a reporter from a wire service, apologetic and clumsy with the kind of news that isn't supposed to be delivered by strangers. A man named Daniel Wren had been arrested 3 states away, multiple counts. The reporter wanted a comment, a memory, anything, because 30 years ago, Daniel Wren had lived at number 12 Larkspur Lane, 4 houses down from a little girl who never came home. Ruth didn't remember hanging up. She only remembered sitting on the edge of her bed for a long time afterward, phone dead in her lap, the ceiling fan turning slow circles above her, and the past arriving all at once like water through a door that had never really been sealed. In the summer of 1979, Larkspur Lane baked under a heat that made the asphalt shimmer and the cicadas scream from noon until dusk. Ruth was 11 that year, all elbows and self-importance, and Mara was 8, small, sunburned, and incapable of walking anywhere when she could skip instead. Mara's laugh was the kind that embarrassed her family in grocery stores. Too loud, too sudden, erupting out of her like something that couldn't be contained by a body that size. She had a gap between her front teeth she was proud of, a bicycle with a bent front wheel she refused to let anyone fix because she liked the way it wobbled, and a habit of narrating her own life out loud. "Now I am the fastest girl in the world, now I am invisible, now I am a queen of the whole street," as though testing which version of herself might turn out to be true. She was, in the memory Ruth kept polished all these years, like a stone worn smooth by handling, always in motion. Never sitting still long enough to be looked at directly. Golden at the edges the way certain afternoons are golden, already halfway to gone even while you're standing inside them. That last evening, the cul-de-sac had that low copper light particular to late July, porch lights not yet on, sprinklers ticking somewhere out of sight. Ruth remembered their mother's voice calling from the screen door, calling the particular rising note she used only at dinner time, calling first for Ruth, who came, sweaty and reluctant, dragging her bike behind her, and then, a few minutes later, calling again. "Mara, dinner." No answer. "Mara Calloway, I mean it." Still nothing, and their mother's voice had that thin thread of irritation in it. The ordinary kind, the kind that assumes a child is simply choosing to ignore her, hiding behind a hedge to giggle at her own daring. Ruth remembered sitting at the table while the food went cold, remembered her father checking his watch, remembered the exact moment. She could still feel it now, 3 decades later, sitting on the edge of a bed in a different city entirely, when irritation folded over into something else, something with teeth. Her mother went out onto the porch and called Mara's name into the dark, and this time there was no music in it at all, no rising note, only a flat, frightened sound that carried all the way down Larkspur Lane and came back empty. By 9 o'clock that night, Larkspur Lane was full of flashlights. They moved in uneven arcs across lawns and hedgerows, beams catching on bicycle spokes and sprinkler heads, on the pale, worried faces of neighbors who had come out in bathrobes and untied sneakers, because someone had knocked on their door and said the word missing, and no one on that street had ever had to hear that word applied to a child before. Ruth stood on the porch in her nightgown, gripping the railing, watching grown men she'd only ever seen mowing lawns or grilling on weekends disappear one by one into the dark, calling a name that wasn't theirs to call. Her mother had gone hoarse by 10. Her father paced the length of the driveway like something wound too tight, snapping the word systematic at anyone who would listen, as though order might be summoned by insisting on it hard enough. The police arrived not long after, first one cruiser, then 2 radios crackling, the red and blue wash of their lights sweeping across the front of every house on the block, painting them in colors they'd never worn before. It was, Ruth would think many years later, the last ordinary night of her childhood, though at the time it only felt like the longest one. The neighbors gathered in loose, murmuring clusters on the Hendersons' lawn, arms crossed against a warmth that hadn't broken even after dark. Someone brought out a folding table, someone else brought coffee no one drank, and it was there at the edge of that gathering, half in shadow, that a boy stood watching. He was 14, tall for his age in the stooped, uncertain way boys are at 14, standing just outside the ring of porch light with his hands in his pockets. Ruth didn't know his name yet. He was simply the boy from number 12, the quiet Wren boy, the one who mowed his own family's lawn in perfectly straight lines and never seemed to be doing anything in particular when you passed his house, only standing at the window or sitting on the front step, watching the street the way other boys watch television. He wasn't crying. He wasn't asking questions like the other children clustered nervously around their parents' legs. He was simply watching the police cars, the flashlights, the shape of the search as it organized itself, with an attention that struck no one as strange that night, because why would it? Grief hadn't taught anyone yet what to look for. An officer with a clipboard moved through the crowd, taking names, taking times, taking the small currency of when did you last see her. When he reached the boy from number 12, Daniel Wren answered without hesitation, in a voice that hadn't yet finished deciding whether it was going to be a man's. I saw her around 4. She was riding her bike past our driveway. She waved at me. Did she say anything? No, she just waved. A pause, brief, unremarkable. She was going toward the Delgado's place, I think. The officer wrote it down and moved on, and no one thought to ask another question because it was, on its surface, nothing. A boy on his porch, a girl on a bicycle, a wave exchanged between neighbors on an ordinary summer evening. It would be years before anyone circled back to that detail and noticed what it actually was. Daniel Wren had been the last person on Larkspur Lane to admit he'd seen Mara Calloway alive. The search lasted 11 days before it stopped being called a search and started being called, quietly, in the careful language of men who hated saying it, a matter of time. They dragged the creek behind the Delgado's property. They walked the drainage ditches along the highway with cadaver dogs that never signaled. They papered 3 counties with a photograph of Mara midlaff, gap-toothed, sunburned, forever 8 years old, on flyers that curled and yellowed on telephone poles through that autumn and into a winter no one had expected to still be searching in. And then, the way these things do, the case simply began to sink, not solved, not closed, just slowly submerged beneath the weight of newer emergencies, until it settled somewhere at the bottom of a filing cabinet in the sheriff's department, cold. Detective Alan Reyes was 29 years old that summer, new enough to the job that he still believed persistence was a virtue rather than a liability, and he could not let it go. He'd been the one to write down Daniel Wren's statement that first night, the one who'd logged saw her around 4. She waved in his own looping handwriting, and something about the boy's stillness had lodged itself under his skin like a splinter he couldn't work free. Not evidence. Reyes knew that. He'd said it to his captain more than once in exactly those words, "I don't have evidence, I have a feeling," and been told, not unkindly, that feelings didn't hold up in front of a judge. So he did what he could within the shape of the feeling. Canvassed the Wren house twice more that fall, always finding Daniel's parents arranged in the same postures of controlled cooperation. His father answering every question in short, complete sentences, his mother sitting slightly behind him, hands folded, eyes on the middle distance. He was home by 5, Mr. Wren said, the second time Reyes sat across from them at their kitchen table, a room so clean it seemed to have been recently and thoroughly erased. He did his chores. We ate dinner at 6. "I don't understand why we're doing this again. I'm just trying to build a full picture, sir." "The picture is full," Mrs. Wren said, without raising her voice, without raising her eyes. "Daniel was here." Reyes noted, without being able to say precisely why it mattered, that neither parent asked him whether there'd been any progress. Neither asked how the Calloways were holding up, 4 houses down, in a home that had begun to smell permanently of casseroles left by neighbors who didn't know what else to bring. There was something in the Wren household silence that felt less like grief-adjacent discomfort and more like a wall built with great care, brick by brick, around whatever lived behind it. He left that afternoon with nothing he could type into a report, and within a year he'd been reassigned. The case file grew a thin skin of dust. The Calloway house, meanwhile, was learning the private architecture of a family that no longer knew how to sit at its own dinner table. Ruth's father began working later. Her mother stopped answering the phone on the first ring, then the second, then not at all some nights, as though refusing to be the one who found out. And Ruth herself, 12 now, then 13, learned to carry a silence of her own, the particular wordless grief of the sibling left behind. Watching her parents' marriage erode a little further every year around a name none of them could say out loud at the dinner table anymore. In a house that had stopped, somewhere along the way, being anyone's home. Grief, Ruth had learned over 3 decades, doesn't dissolve. It just changes shape, settles into the architecture of a person the way water finds its way into the foundations of a house. Until one day you realize the whole structure has been quietly reorganized around a crack no one ever repaired. Her parents' marriage hadn't survived it. Her father died 9 years ago, still keeping Mara's old bicycle, bent wheel and all, hanging from 2 hooks in a garage 3 states from Larkspur Lane, as though the machine itself might one day be needed again. Her mother lived now in an assisted care facility in Ohio and asked on her better days whether Mara had called. Ruth had built a life on the far side of all that wreckage. She'd become, of all things, a journalist, the kind who specialized, with a specificity that colleagues occasionally found unsettling, in cases that never closed. Missing persons, cold homicides, the unbearable, unfinished sentences that other reporters lost interest in once the story stopped being new. She told herself this was professional instinct. She had never once said out loud, not even to herself in the dark, that it was something closer to penance or searching or both. Her apartment in Portland told the truth her mouth didn't. One bedroom had long since stopped being a bedroom and become something closer to an archive. A wall of corkboard strung with red thread that had started, years ago, as a joke about herself and had simply never come down. 3 filing cabinets, second-hand and slightly rusted, containing photocopies of a police report she'd requested under public records law the year she turned 30. A single manila folder, worn soft at the corners from handling, with her sister's name written on the tab in Ruth's own careful hand. She had never shown that room to anyone she dated. She had never fully explained it to herself either, except to say that closing the door on it had always felt like a second abandonment, and she'd promised some younger version of herself she wouldn't do that twice. So when the phone rang at 6:14 that morning and a stranger's voice said Daniel Wren and multiple counts in 3 states away, some part of Ruth that had been standing very still for 30 years finally exhaled. She sat for a long time after the call ended, the light outside her window turning from black to gray to the flat, indifferent blue of an ordinary morning. Then she rose, walked into the room with the corkboard and the red thread, and stood in the doorway looking at her sister's photograph the way she hadn't allowed herself to look at it in years, not as evidence, not as a case file, but as a small girl on a bicycle waving. She booked the flight before she'd finished her coffee. There was no ceremony to it, no dramatic decision made in slow motion. Just her fingers moving across a keyboard with the calm, practiced efficiency of a woman who had, without quite admitting it to herself, been packing this particular bag for 30 years. Larkspur Lane no longer existed under that name. The county had renamed the street sometime in the 90s, some minor bureaucratic tidying that had nonetheless felt, when she'd learned of it, like one more small erasure of her sister from the world. But the town was still there. The people who remembered were still there, some of them. And so, she suspected, was the truth buried somewhere beneath 30 years of cold ground, waiting for someone finally willing to dig. She had one name to start with. A detective who had never let the case go either. Alan Reyes lived now in a small house at the edge of town with a porch that sagged slightly on one side and a garden he tended with more discipline than he'd ever managed to bring to his own retirement. He was 60 now, silver at the temples, moving with the careful stiffness of a man whose knees had outlived his patience for them. When Ruth found him, he was kneeling in the dirt, pulling weeds from around a row of tomato plants, and he looked up at her over his glasses with an expression that suggested he'd been expecting this visit for 30 years and was still somehow not ready for it. "You're Ruth Calloway," he said, not a question. "You remember." "I never stopped." He rose slowly, brushing soil from his knees, and gestured toward 2 folding chairs on the porch as though he'd set them out that morning for precisely this purpose. "Coffee's old, fair warning." She took it anyway. They sat in the thin afternoon light, and for a moment neither of them said anything, the silence doing the work that 30 years usually requires. "You heard about Wren," she said finally. "I heard." His jaw tightened just slightly. "Been hearing about it on every channel since Tuesday." "Multiple counts, 3 states." He shook his head and something in his face cracked open, not surprise, she realized, recognition. "I want you to understand something, Ms. Calloway. I have thought about your sister every single day since 1979, not most days, every day." "Why?" "Because I knew." He said it flatly, without drama, the way a man states a fact he's tired of carrying. "I knew it was that boy. I knew it the first night, standing on your lawn, watching him watch us. I've been a cop long enough now, I was a cop long enough then, even young as I was, to trust that feeling, and I never had one shred of evidence to back it up, not one." His hands folded in his lap tightened. "I interviewed his parents 4 times, 4. Same answers every time, word for word, like they'd rehearsed it in the mirror. I requested a search of their property and got laughed out of the judge's office. I had nothing but a boy who was too calm and a family that was too quiet, and neither of those things has ever been enough to arrest anyone. You believed him guilty and you couldn't do anything. I believed him guilty and I watched your family fall apart 4 houses down while I did nothing." His voice roughened. "I went to your father's funeral, you know, stood in the back. Didn't think either of you would want to see my face there." Ruth felt something in her chest give way, some old, cold weight shifting for the first time in years. "I wish I'd known that. I wish someone had told me you never stopped believing us. Would it have mattered? It would have meant I wasn't crazy. 30 years of people telling me gently to let it go." She looked at him. "You never let it go either." "No." He met her eyes, and in them she saw the particular exhaustion of a man who has spent 3 decades rehearsing an apology he never got to give. And now they've got him on 8 murders that we know of in 3 states with a signature the papers are calling methodical and ritualistic. He exhaled. "Ruth, I need you to understand what I'm about to say because I've never said it to another living soul. The pattern they're describing, the way he takes his time, the way he watches first, I've seen it. I saw the beginning of it. It started on our street." Reyes's words stayed with her the whole drive back. It started on our street, turning over and over like a stone in her pocket. And by the time Ruth pulled onto what had once been Larkspur Lane, she felt less like she was arriving somewhere new than descending into something she'd never actually left. The street had a different name now, stamped in green on a leaning sign at the corner, Willowbrook Court, some developer's bland poetry from a decade of renaming, but the bones of it were unmistakable. The cul-de-sac still curved the same way, still cradled the same 6 houses in its palm, though most of them wore the particular exhaustion of a neighborhood no one had chosen to love in a long time. Chain link had replaced picket fencing. 2 houses stood empty, windows boarded, lawns gone to seed. A basketball hoop, rimless, hung at a dead angle over an empty driveway like something that had given up mid-sentence. Number 12 was the worst of them. The Wren house had not been lived in for years. Ruth would learn later that Daniel's parents had died within 18 months of each other, long before their son's name ever made national news, and the property had simply sat unclaimed and unloved, accruing decay the way other houses accrue memory. The paint had gone the gray-brown of old bone. The porch where a 14-year-old boy had once stood watching flashlights sweep the dark now sagged inward, one step rotted through entirely. The front window, the one Ruth remembered him standing behind, so often so still, was cracked in a long diagonal fracture, catching the afternoon light at an angle that made it look, for one unsettling moment, like something watching back. She stood at the curb a long time before she made herself knock on a different door. Vera Delgado still lived 3 houses down, 81 now, sharp-eyed, moving through her small kitchen with the brisk economy of a woman who had outlived most of her own patience for nonsense. She remembered Ruth immediately, pulled her into a hug that smelled of lavender and old paper, and set 2 cups of tea on a table between them before either of them had said Mara's name. "I always wondered if anyone would come back and ask," Vera said finally, staring into her cup. "Nobody ever really asked me, not properly, not the way that matters." "Asked you what?" Vera's hands, spotted and thin, tightened around the mug. "There's something I saw that night I never told the police." She looked up, and 30 years of held silence sat plainly in her face. "I was young then, 38, with 2 babies of my own in that house. I was standing at my kitchen window around dusk, waiting for my husband, and I saw the Wren boy walking at the edge of our yard near the tree line toward the drainage ditch by the old Kessler property. He was carrying something. I couldn't tell what, small, wrapped in something dark. I told myself it was nothing. A dog, a toy, laundry. I told myself that for 30 years. Ruth went very still. "Why didn't you say anything?" Vera's eyes filled, quick and sudden. "Because 2 nights later I found my cat on my back step, throat cut clean, laid out neat as a gift." Her voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. "I never told a soul that either. I was afraid, Ruth. I've been afraid for 30 years. I think I still am." The request took 6 weeks to process, 3 phone calls to a warden's assistant who seemed to enjoy making her wait, and 1 letter, brief, formal, faintly amused in tone, from Daniel Wren himself, granting his consent. "Of course I remember Ruth. Tell her I'd be happy to talk about old times." She read that sentence more times than she could account for on the drive to the facility, a low gray complex ringed with razor wire under a sky the same flat color as the walls. She'd expected, walking in, that her body might rebel, hands shaking, throat closing. Instead, she felt an eerie, watchful calm, the same stillness she remembered from Vera's kitchen, as though some part of her had been rehearsing this moment for 30 years and had finally arrived at its cue. They brought him in shackled at the wrists, and Ruth made herself look at him directly. He was 59 now, silver-haired, softened at the jaw the way most men are by age, and there was nothing outwardly monstrous about him. That was, she understood immediately, precisely the point. He sat across the plexiglass, picked up the phone, and smiled at her with an ease that made her skin crawl. "Ruth Calloway," he said, "you've grown up. You remember me. I remember everyone from Larkspur Lane." He tilted his head, studying her the way a collector studies an old, familiar piece. "You used to ride your bike past our house every afternoon. Mara always waved first. You never did." Her hand tightened around the receiver. "I'm not here to talk about bike rides." "No." Smile didn't move. "You're here to ask me if I killed your sister, did you?" He let the silence stretch, savoring it the way she imagined he'd learned to savor everything over 30 years of practice. "That's an interesting question to ask a man who's already been convicted of 8 murders, none of which happened anywhere near your little street." He leaned forward slightly. "Why do you think I'd tell you the truth about a 9th? Because you like an audience," Reyes had told her before she'd come. "Men like this don't confess for forgiveness, they confess for control." She held onto that now like a rope. "Maybe I just want to know," she said. "After 30 years, maybe that's all I want." "Everyone always says that." Daniel's eyes, pale and unhurried, moved over her face like he was reading something written there. "I just want to know, as if knowing would fix anything. As if I handed you the truth right now and your sister would come back through that door." He gestured mildly toward the visitation room's steel entrance. "She wouldn't, Ruth. Knowing changes nothing. It's just a story you'd get to carry differently." "Then tell me the story. Tell me first." His voice dropped, gentler now, almost intimate, and that gentleness was worse than any threat could have been. "Do you still think about her every day, or has it faded? I always wondered, watching your family from our porch, how long grief like that actually lasts before it just becomes background noise." Ruth felt something in her chest go very cold and very still. "You watched us." "I watched everyone. It's the only interesting thing to do on a street like that." He shrugged, an almost boyish gesture that landed obscenely on a man his age in that place, having said what he just said. "You want a confession, I understand that. But confessions are gifts, Ruth, and gifts are for people who have earned them." Sat back, unhurried, unbothered, a man with nothing left to lose and every reason to enjoy the leverage that gave him. "Come back and see me again. Maybe next time I'll feel generous." The guard signaled the end of the visit. Daniel rose without being told twice, still watching her through the glass as they led him away, and at the door he turned his head one last time and said, almost fondly, "Give my regards to your mother. Ask her if she still remembers the sound Mara's bike made. That wobble. I always liked that sound. She didn't sleep that night or the one after." Daniel's voice kept surfacing in the dark. "That wobble, I always liked that sound," until she gave up trying to outrun it and instead did the only thing that had ever quieted her mind. She went back to the files. Reyes met her the next morning at his kitchen table, a legal pad between them, and beside it, a thick manila envelope he'd requested through old department contacts still willing to do him favors. Inside were case summaries from Daniel Wren's 8 known murders, spanning 3 states and nearly 2 decades, women mostly, taken from small towns and quiet suburban streets not unlike the one Ruth had grown up on, their disappearances separated by years of careful, deliberate silence in between. He waited, Reyes said, spreading the summaries across the table. Sometimes 3 years between victims, sometimes 5. That's not impulse, Ruth, that's discipline. He was choosing his moments. Ruth scanned the pages, and a cold recognition began pooling low in her stomach. Each victim had been watched first, sometimes for weeks, sometimes longer, before being taken. Each disappearance had occurred in daylight, in ordinary populated places, executed with a precision that had left almost no physical evidence behind in 6 of the 8 cases. And in every file, repeated with the eerie consistency of a signature, was a single detail. Something small belonging to each victim had been left behind deliberately for family to find. A shoe, a hair ribbon, a single earring placed with obvious care on a porch step or windowsill as though it were a gift rather than a threat. He likes them to know, Ruth said slowly, that he did it, without ever having to say so. That's exactly it, said a voice from the doorway. Dana Osei was in her 40s, sharp-eyed, unhurried in the way of someone accustomed to walking into rooms already thick with other people's grief. Reyes had called her the week before, a former colleague from a joint task force, now consulting with the FBI's behavioral unit on the Wren case specifically, and she'd flown out at her own expense the moment she'd heard why. "I've been building his profile for 3 weeks, she said, setting her own folder down beside theirs. "And I want to be honest with you both because I think you've earned that. What I'm seeing in his known victims isn't the beginning of a pattern, it's the refinement of one." She looked at Ruth directly. "Predators like this don't emerge fully formed in their 30s, they're built, practiced. What you're describing from 1979, the watching, the waiting, a token left behind that only a family would recognize as significant." "There wasn't a token," Ruth said quietly. "Mara was never found. There was nothing left behind at all." Osei was quiet for a moment. "Are you certain of that?" The question landed like a stone dropped into still water, and Ruth felt every ring of it move outward through her chest. She thought of her mother standing on that porch 30 years ago calling into the dark. She thought of the search, 11 days of it, the flyers curling on telephone poles, her father pacing the driveway insisting on the word systematic as though order could be summoned by force of will alone. "I need to see the original case file," she said. "The whole thing, every photograph, every report, every item logged as found on that property or anywhere near it." Reyes was already reaching for his phone. "I can request it. It'll take some pulling, 30 years buried in county storage. Pull it," Ruth said. "Because if he left something behind in 1979 and no one ever thought to look for it as what it actually was." Osei finished the thought for her, gently, the way a woman does who has said this exact sentence to too many families before. "Then somewhere in that file, Ruth, your sister may have been trying to tell you something all along." The county released the original file 9 days later. A thick and water-stained box smelling faintly of mildew and 30 years of storage. And it was in that box, buried beneath photographs and yellowed statements, that Ruth found the thing she hadn't known to look for. A small evidence log dated 4 days after Mara's disappearance, noting a child's hair ribbon recovered from the tree line near the Kessler property. The same tree line Vera Delgado had watched Daniel Wren walk toward, carrying something dark 30 years ago. Beside the entry in handwriting Ruth recognized instantly because she'd grown up watching it fill out check stubs and birthday cards, was a single word scrawled in the margin: withheld, her father's handwriting. She sat with that word for a long time before she understood what it meant, that her father, then a respected member of the very civic committee that had helped organize the search, had somehow seen this evidence log, and for reasons the file didn't explain, ensured it never made it into Reyes' official investigation. She called Reyes, voice shaking in a way she couldn't fully control. "Did you know about this?" "No." His silence afterward was long and heavy. "Ruth, I swear to you, I never saw that ribbon logged anywhere. If I had—" "I know," she said, though the words cost her something. "I know you would have." The confrontation she couldn't have, her father 9 years gone, buried under a headstone she visited twice a year out of duty more than grief, she found instead in a box of his old journals her mother had kept, unread, in a closet for a decade. She found the entry dated 3 weeks after Mara vanished, her father's handwriting tighter and more frantic than she'd ever seen it. "Found out today that Robert Wren sits on the same zoning board that's reviewing my business license renewal. If I push too hard on what the log shows, if I make an accusation I can't prove against his son, I could lose everything I've built. I told myself I was protecting this family. God forgive me, I don't know anymore what I was protecting." Ruth read it twice, then drove 3 hours to Ohio, to the assisted care facility where her mother now lived in the soft fog of advancing memory, and asked the question she'd never had the courage to ask before. "Did you know about what he did?" Her mother's eyes, faded but still sharp in unexpected moments, filled slowly. "I knew he was afraid," she said. "I knew there was something he wasn't telling the police, and I knew it had something to do with that family. I asked him once, only once, and he told me it was better if I didn't know the details. I let him have that. God help me, I let him have that because I couldn't carry one more thing that year, and I told myself if he was protecting us it must have been necessary. He protected the wrong family, Ruth said, and the words tasted like acid in her mouth. He let a monster keep walking free because he was afraid of losing a business license. Her mother's hand, thin and trembling, reached across the table for hers. He carried that the rest of his life, Ruth. I think it's what killed him in the end more than his heart ever did. Her voice broke. We failed her, all of us in our own ways. I've spent 30 years telling myself we did everything we could, and I don't think that's true anymore. I don't think it was ever true. Ruth sat with her mother's hand in hers. The weight of it, her father's silence, her mother's complicity. 30 years of a family quietly protecting itself instead of the truth, settling over her like something she would now have to learn to carry for the rest of her life, into whatever came next. The letter came 4 months later, 3 lines in Daniel Wren's tidy, unhurried handwriting. His execution date had been set, and he wrote, feeling generous as promised. He would see her one final time if she wanted it. Ruth almost didn't go. She sat with the letter for 2 full days, Ray's voice in her ear. Men like this don't confess for forgiveness. They confess for control, and Osai's warning that whatever he offered her now would likely be shaped less by conscience than by a dying man's last opportunity to matter. She thought of the ribbon in that evidence box, of her father's handwriting curling around a single damning word, of 30 years spent not knowing, and she got on the plane. He looked smaller this time, in the way condemned men sometimes do, as though the date on the calendar had already begun subtracting something from him. But his eyes, when he lifted the phone to his ear, held the same unhurried amusement they'd held before. You came back, he said. I wondered if you would. You said you'd be generous. I did say that. He studied her for a long moment. You found the ribbon, didn't you? I can see it on your face. 30 years, and your own father buried the one piece of you that might have led anywhere. Her hands went cold around the receiver. How do you know about that? I don't, he said, and smiled in a way that told her nothing at all. That could have meant I'm guessing, or could have meant I've always known exactly where I left it. But I know men like your father, careful men. Men who protect what they've built before they protect what's right. It's not so different from what I do when you think about it. We both understood very young that most people will let a terrible thing stay buried if burying it is convenient enough. Did you kill my sister? You keep asking that as though the answer will feel different depending on how many times you say it. Tell me. He leaned forward, and for the first time something flickered behind his composure. Not guilt, she understood watching him, but pleasure, the particular pleasure of a man about to be handed exactly the kind of power he'd spent his whole life collecting. I'll tell you what I'll tell you, Ruth, and then I won't say another word about it, not to you, not to anyone, not even standing on that platform with the needle already in my arm. He paused, savoring it. Her sister was the first time I understood what I was. Everything after her, every woman in every state, every careful year of waiting between them, all of it started on that street, watching a little girl wave at me from her bicycle like I was someone worth waving at. His voice dropped, almost tender. I never said I killed her, I said she was the beginning. You can decide for yourself what that means. That's not a confession. No, he agreed, unbothered. It's better than one. A confession gives you certainty, and certainty is a kind of peace. I'd rather leave you with neither. He rose as the guard signaled the end of the visit, unhurried even now, a man arranging his own exit exactly the way he wanted it remembered. At the door, he turned back one final time. Goodbye, Ruth. Give my regards to whatever's left of Larkspur Lane. They led him away, and Ruth sat alone in the visitation room long after the phone had gone dead in her hand, understanding with a cold, settling finality that this unbearable, permanent uncertainty was the only inheritance he had ever intended to leave her, and that she would carry it now the way her father had carried his silence for the rest of her life. The district attorney's office called it, in the careful language of people who deal daily in the gap between what is true and what is provable, insufficient for prosecution. A single hair ribbon decades old with no chain of custody that would survive a defense attorney's first objection. A neighbor's memory, honest but unreliable after 30 years, and one dead cat left as a warning. A dying man's words that implied everything and confirmed nothing, spoken to a private citizen with no recording device and no legal standing to make them count. Daniel Wren would go to his execution having been convicted of 8 murders and formally accused of none in connection with Larkspur Lane. Mara Calloway's case would remain permanently, in the language of the file itself, unsolved. Ruth had expected this news to break something in her. Instead, sitting in Ray's kitchen with the folder open between them one last time, she found something closer to clarity. The law needs proof, she said slowly. I don't think I do, not anymore. Ray's looked at her for a long moment, then nodded as though he'd been waiting 30 years for someone to say exactly that. She spent the following months writing not an article, not the kind of clean, hedged journalism she'd built her career on, but something closer to testimony. She wrote about a girl who narrated her own life out loud. Now I am the fastest girl in the world. She wrote about a boy who watched from a porch with an attention no one had known yet to fear. She wrote about a detective who never stopped believing, a neighbor who kept a silence out of terror for 30 years, a father who chose a business license over his own daughter and carried that choice into his grave. She wrote finally about herself, The sister left behind to grow up in the wreckage of a family that never learned how to speak Mara's name at its own dinner table again. She published it under her own name in full and made no claim in it that a court would recognize as fact. Only what she and Reyes and Vera and Osa had gathered, laid out honestly, with every uncertainty marked as uncertainty and every conviction marked as her own. It would never put Daniel Wren behind bars for Mara's death. He was already beyond the reach of any sentence the world could add to his, but it would exist permanently as a record that refused to let the unsolved stay unspoken. The piece ran 2 weeks before his execution date. He did not write to her again. Afterward, Ruth drove back to Willowbrook Court one final time, alone, in the low copper light of a late afternoon that felt uncannily like the one she carried in memory from 1979. Number 12 had finally been condemned by the county, a demolition notice stapled crookedly to its rotted porch post. She stood at the curb a long while, not going closer, simply looking at the house that had watched her family for so many years without ever being watched back closely enough. In her bag was the one photograph she'd kept close through all of it, Mara mid-laugh, gap-toothed, sunburned, bicycle tipped against the porch rail, forever 8 years old. Ruth had spent 30 years treating that photograph like evidence, like the last remaining exhibit in a case that would never close. Standing there now, she let herself look at it instead the way she should have been allowed to all along, not as proof of anything, but simply as her sister, golden and fleeting, already halfway to gone even while she was standing right there. For the first time in 30 years, Ruth let herself cry for Mara instead of for the case. 2 years passed before the county finally sent the crew out to Willowbrook Court, and Ruth made the drive again, this time without needing a reason beyond wanting to see it through to the end. She stood at the same curb where she'd stood before, coffee going cold in her hand, watching a small crowd gather the way crowds gather for anything final, a few remaining neighbors, a county official with a clipboard, a photographer from the local paper who had no idea what the house had once meant to anyone. The excavator's arm rose against a pale morning sky, hesitated for a moment as though even machinery understood the weight of what it was about to do, and then swung. The first strike took the porch, the same sagging porch where a 14-year-old boy had once stood in shadow watching flashlights sweep the dark, answering a police officer's question in a voice that hadn't yet decided what kind of man it would grow into. It came down in a soft collapse of rotted wood and 30-year-old silence. The second strike took the cracked front window, the one that had always seemed to Ruth like something watching back. Glass scattered across the overgrown lawn and caught the light in small, indifferent flashes. By noon, number 12 Larkspur Lane, Willowbrook Court now, and soon to be nothing at all, was a pile of gray timber and broken brick. And the cul-de-sac, for the first time in Ruth's living memory, held no house that had ever belonged to Daniel Wren. She thought watching it fall of everything the law had never been able to give her. No trial for Mara. No verdict, no sentence, no official record stamped with the word guilty beside her sister's name. The courts dealt only in proof, and proof, as Reyes had told her once on his porch with tomato dirt still under his fingernails, was a narrow and unforgiving thing built for certainty a case like this could never fully provide. But she understood something now that she hadn't understood at 11 years old, standing beside her mother on a porch calling into an empty dark. Justice in its purest legal form might never come. But belief, the plain, stubborn act of being believed by a detective who never let it go, by a neighbor who broke 30 years of silence, by a sister willing to carry the whole unbearable weight of an unsolved case into the light, that was its own kind of reckoning. Imperfect. Incomplete. But real in the way that mattered most to the people left standing after everyone else had moved on. Monsters, she thought, are so often known long before the world ever agrees to name them. A boy on a porch watching too closely. A silence in a kitchen that felt even then like something rehearsed. A wave from a bicycle, answered by a stillness no one thought to fear. Belief had lived on Larkspur Lane for 30 years before the world caught up to it, carried quietly by the people who refused to let it go. Ruth stayed until the last beam came down, until the dust settled over what had once been number 12, and then she got back in her car and did not look back. She kept in the years that followed only one photograph on her desk. Not the flyer, curled and yellowed with searching, not the evidence log with her father's damning handwriting in the margin, but the one of Mara mid-laugh, gap-toothed, sunburned, bicycle wobbling beneath her on a golden summer afternoon. Finally, after 30 years, her sister belonged to memory again and not to mystery.